Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Great to see you attending this highly topical and timely event. And I hope nobody will get dizzy with the background, but this is an issue that gets us sometimes dizzy at the International Committee of the Red Cross. My name is Gilles Carbonnier. I'm the Vice President of the ICRC, and it's really I'm very glad that we have the chance to have these conversations here with key stakeholders interested in AI in peace and conflict. And I would like to just thank all the organizers, of course, and sponsors of the AI House, and in particular Swisscom with Daniel Davos and Professor Illich and Krause of the ETH Zurich for offering us the possibility to stage this panel conversation with a great group of panelists and experts. One question often that I hear people saying, including in my family, is why as a humanitarian do you care and spend time and energy on discussion on AI? And I think it's key to understand that actually we, the International Committee of the Red Cross, of course, our role is to protect and assist people affected by armed conflicts all across the world. But our role is also to engage states and to engage the military on their obligations under the Geneva Conventions and on their obligation under international humanitarian writ large. And since the very beginning, 160 years ago, when we were created, one of our founding fathers was a surgeon, and he immediately introduced innovation to increase the efficiency and efficacy of war surgery. But at the same time, for 160 years, what we saw is that technological innovation keeps changing the face and how warfare is conducted, and this has really very serious implication for the protection of civilians and for the way we are able to protect and assist people, especially protected populations in armed conflict. So I think that we are all aware that now with the very fast advance of digital technologies and Gen AI these days, not only in the civilian sphere, but also in the military sphere, the stakes are high. And as we say at the ICRC, armed conflict is sometimes a magnifier of what are the real risks and the opportunities to some extent for us as a humanitarian organization. So, for decades, now 2 decades, we have followed digitalization. We have engaged conversations with tech firms, with the scientific community, and also with states on what it means for upholding obligations under international humanitarian law. And the panel today will really focus on the potential harm and how to avert the potential harm. I will also say a few words, but just let me first say that we'll also see the huge opportunities. For example, we have partners 3-4 years ago with the 2 technological schools in Switzerland of Lausanne and Zurich in a great partnership where we conduct joint research. And the result of this joint research is then translated into practical applications that we can roll out in the field. And we also set up educational programs for our staff. And just to give you an example, these research include the use of drones with AI to detect landmines and unexploded ordnances in urban areas, to have much better early warning systems through the remote monitoring of potential conflicts and evolution of conflicts, harnessing the potential of AI to uncover certain patterns of violence, but also what works in terms of having armed carriers respecting IHL, and what doesn't and why. And finally, vulnerable, very vulnerable population and movement of population using also satellite imagery and AI. So now on the harm, of course, as the guardian of the Geneva Conventions of International Humanitarian Law, we have great concerns about a number of issues when we see the use of AI, especially in autonomous weapon systems. And one of the greatest concern is that we really not only believe, but we think it is absolutely paramount to keep an element of human control and human decision on life and death decisions. And we cannot have weapons with machine learning and AI as a way to target, which produce unpredictable outcomes. And then there is also the great question of accountability. Who is accountable for violations in those cases? So I'm sure that these are issues we will discuss in great depth with the panelists. And what I think is also interesting is to see the World Economic Forum last week releasing its 2024 Global Risk Report and saying, and I quote, "The creep of machine intelligence into conflict decision-making to autonomously select targets and determine objectives would significantly raise the risk of accidental or intentional escalation over the next decades." So what I want to emphasize is that we have engaged states, but also other stakeholders who are here with us today on how we can collectively come to grip with the risks so that they do not materialize. And in October, our president, Mirjana Spoljaric, joined hands with the UN Secretary General, Guterres, to appeal to states to urgently regulate the use of AI in autonomous weapon systems. And I think there is a sense of urgency that appropriate regulations is needed at the international level. So for that, we will need continuous engagement with industry experts, as well as with scientists and people from academia. And here we are with a stellar panel. So without further ado, I give you, Raj, I give you the floor, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gilles. So this is, I think, a quintessential Davos session in that we're talking about the very latest technology trend. We're telling you how it's going to completely change the world going forward, and we're helping you sort of look around the corner of what's coming. And if you feel a bit like you're a character in a sci-fi movie, that's what we're going for here, because this is the real world we're in now. And this is what happens at Davos. We're in a small corner of a building, and we're talking about some of the most urgent issues facing the planet. And all of us get the great pleasure to be here for this session. You'll find out in a moment the great expertise we have on this panel to have this discussion, which I'm thrilled to lead. My name is Kumar, and I'm the president and editor-in-chief at Devex. And so our journalists are covering all the time humanitarian issues and development issues, and AI increasingly is intersecting with those very issues. So I'm keen to learn, as I think are all of you, where we might be heading. Now, AI and the humanitarian space have many places they can cross. One of the most kind of arresting that might get you to the edge of your seat is to think about autonomous weapons systems, where weapons and AI kind of converge. And we have with us really the world expert on this topic, someone who probably needs no introduction to many of you, especially in the world of computer science, in Stuart Russell. He's a professor of computer science at the University of California, Berkeley. You probably heard him speak before or read his books or his work. And so it's a great pleasure, Stuart, to have you kind of get us started with why should we care? Why should we be worried about this issue? What is the landscape that we're facing when it comes to the military and their potential use of AI?
Thanks, Raj. So let's think about an image. And if you've ever read any article in the media about lethal autonomous weapons, the image that they invariably put along with the article is the rampaging Terminator image. I got to the point where I would refuse to talk to journalists unless they promised not to put the rampaging Terminator image, which is both wrong and confusing and leads people in completely the wrong direction to understand what's going on. So first of all, it's just wrong, right? Terminators are huge, slow, heavy, humanoid, bipedal robots.
And expensive.
Very expensive. Secondly, they keep firing bullets and missing people, right? Which doesn't make any sense at all if you think about a robot that can decide and react in a microsecond, like the time it takes a human to move about a millimeter, they can aim and fire their weapons. So it's completely silly. And thirdly, the Terminator narrative is all about superintelligent AI taking over the world through these physical weapon systems. So it sort of completely confuses the issue. And finally, it makes people think that this is science fiction, that we don't need to worry about this until there are giant super brains that become conscious and that decide they hate humans and then want to kill us, right? So it's completely starting off on the wrong foot. What we mean by lethal autonomous weapons systems is systems that can locate, select, and engage human targets without human intervention. And that's a actually pretty straightforward set of criteria for AI systems to satisfy. And in degenerate ways, landmines already do that. There are landmines that they just physically will only explode if there's a certain amount of metal nearby or if the pressure exceeds a certain amount, then they explode. So they have a very crude form of selection. They have a degenerate form of locating, right? Anything that's on top of me is a target. And they can certainly engage. Engage is a euphemism for kill human beings. And they are, in fact, banned. And they are banned because it was shown over and over again in practice that they are indiscriminate, that they kill thousands of civilians, they maim civilians, children, et cetera, et cetera. So what's happening now in Ukraine, for example, is because of jamming, it's no longer possible in many parts of the theater to use remotely piloted weapons. Again, remotely piloted weapons are not autonomous. There is human intervention. There's a human pilot who is deciding where to go and who to kill. An autonomous weapon replaces the human pilot with onboard AI. If you have onboard AI, you don't need a radio link, and so you can operate even when there's electronic warfare countermeasures. And so both Russia and the Ukraine have already moved from remotely piloted drones to fully autonomous drones. So there are now lethal autonomous weapon systems that are out there killing people. And this is only going to get more and more common because it's seen to be a military necessity. So then the question is, well, what's wrong with that? And starting around 2012, there was a report from Christoph Heinz, who was the special rapporteur on extrajudicial killings for the United Nations. And he wrote a report saying these weapons are coming down the pipe, and we need to be concerned and think about implications for human rights and international humanitarian law. So international humanitarian law is what governs the conduct of war. It's a slightly strange name, but that's what it's about. And in particular, it says you can't have weapons that are indiscriminate. It has to be possible for the operator of the weapon to use it in such a way that it targets combatants and not civilians. And of course, if an AI system is unable to make that distinction, then these weapons would possibly contravene IHL, and that was, I think, the major concern early on that led to negotiations at the UN in Geneva, starting in 2014. But obviously, the ability of an AI system to distinguish between civilians and combatants is a moving target. It might have been difficult back then. Maybe now it's possible, and quite feasibly in the future, they will be better than human soldiers at making that decision. So from an AI point of view, that's just a challenge, right? Okay, yeah, we can do better. And then does that mean lethal autonomous weapons will be fine? So as I thought about this, I think there are other things besides IHL. There are pragmatic security questions. Will the existence of a given type of weapon make human physical security greater or lesser? Right? Will it create more wars or fewer wars? And those questions are orthogonal to IHL, but they still really matter. And if you think about not the Terminator, but a little quadcopter 2 or 3 inches across, so whatever that is, 5 to 7.5 centimeters across, carrying enough explosive to kill somebody, where you could make that for maybe 10 bucks. So just to give you a sense, right, a landmine with half a kilogram of explosive costs about $6. Right? So that has some electronics, it has some mechanics, and it has a lot of explosive. So this is not much more difficult to make than that. You know, the AI can be, you know, printed on a chip, and you know, if you know anything about automotive chips, those cost pennies for the chips that go into cars. So we're talking about a lethal weapon for under $20. And so that means you can have a container with 1 million weapons for $20 million that can kill as many people as a hydrogen bomb. And if you think about ISIS, when they were controlling large parts of Iraq and Syria, their monthly income was over $1 billion. So they could afford something like 30 to 50 hydrogen bombs every month, right? Which is more than the US and the Soviet Union actually were able to produce, at the height of their nuclear weapons production. So we would be in a situation where anyone with enough money can buy weapons of mass destruction in arms markets around the world. You know, it would be just like selling hydrogen bombs in, Migros or Walmart or Tesco or whatever's your favorite local supermarket, right? It would be an absolute catastrophe for international security, for personal security. Imagine drug cartels being able to use these to threaten civilian populations and get their own way whenever they want it, right? So this, it seems to me, is an obvious consequence. This is what's going to happen if you just think about the evolution of the technology.
So maybe on that point, we can bring Peggy Hicks into this discussion. I want to come back around to you if I can, Stuart. But
sure. Yeah.
I think you've really laid out, I hope, hopefully in the kind of arresting way I had predicted for all of you.
Is everyone terrified?
Yeah, just like what's possible when you take current technologies, not far off, current technologies, and you add this layer of AI. But this is not the only example where AI can get involved in our basic rights as people and can create security risks. And so there are issues like surveillance and misinformation, disinformation. I thought, Peggy, maybe you can kind of give us a sense of the landscape of issues you see. You're at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the UN, and you are charged with and thinking very much about this intersection of digital tools like AI and what it means for our rights on this planet. How do you see this AI evolution impacting human rights?
Great, thanks. And no, Stuart, what Stuart has talked about is certainly enough to keep us up at night. But I think anybody who is working in this space, it's not just that. There's plenty out there that's scary. As was alluded to earlier, we also do try to focus on how we can use AI to actually make real advances in human rights. But when we look at the landscape around artificial intelligence and human rights, one of the most important things that's happened is ChatGPT. Not for all the reasons that you think, but because ChatGPT got everybody talking about AI and actually looking at the human rights implications of AI more generally. Gen AI is not our only AI problem. And we on the human rights side have been talking, as you said, about the massive rollout of facial recognition in law enforcement. Now, law enforcement isn't a far step down the line from the military applications that are being talked about, yet we are seeing law enforcement, justice systems, predictive policing, all relying on AI. So this idea that we're rolling out technologies that have adverse impacts on human rights is something that we're confronted with every day. I'd put them into three big baskets of the concerns that we're talking about, although you can multiply that across the full set of rights in the Universal Declaration if you'd like. But we're looking in particular at issues around disinformation. Disinformation can obviously exists and does exist without AI, but the ability of AI and Gen AI to fuel and supercharge some of the ways in which disinformation can have an impact on the full range of rights, including its use, for example, to harass, surveil, go after human rights defenders and opposition in different ways. We also are really concerned about issues around privacy and data and sensitive data and the leaks of sensitive data and how data is being used to form the foundation for not only generative AI, but also the accumulation of data that's used in AI uses more generally. And then the third basket relates to discrimination. We all know that the data that I'm just talking about is data that includes all sorts of inherent biases. It reflects the world around us, and that world around us is now being brought in a way where the checks and balances may not be there. And all of these applications, including those ultimately on the most lethal side, will bring in all the flaws that already exist within human society, and discrimination being one of those that we've all sorts of evidence already about the ways that AI systems, discriminate against people of color, for example. So we need to make sure that we're putting in place risk proportionate regulation that will address those types of concerns going forward.
So let me bring in our private sector representative here if I can, because in some ways, people like myself, and maybe like Gilles, we're very optimistic about AI. There's a lot of exciting new tools that we can use, and many of them are being provided by companies like Microsoft. But on the other hand, you are now finding yourself at the center of this kind of a conversation where there are enormous implications for society depending on how these tools get rolled out. So Teresa Hutson is the corporate vice president of Microsoft, and you're charged with technology for fundamental rights. I mean, even the fact that your role exists says something about your company's perspective on these issues, but maybe you can take us a little bit inside the corporate veil. Do you talk about these kinds of conversations inside Microsoft? Do you see the threats? And obviously you see the upsides, but do you see the threats as well? And what do you think can actually be done about them?
Yeah, we talk about it all the time. I mean, as you said, the fact that my job exists indicates we talk about it. We have other teams that focus really on responsible AI broadly. I think one of the things we've really done is think about how you build technology in a rights-respecting way. And I mean that you have to get super specific and operational and, create process for engineers to assess what they're doing and think about what are the impacts on people, how many people will it impact, what are the potential unintended consequences. We have these responsible AI principles around fairness and transparency and accountability. Those are really, really important, and I'm really happy we do this. And we also have a very specific process for so-called sensitive uses, where something will impact life or legal status, could create psychological or physical harm, or impact human rights. And when there is that case, it requires an additional level of oversight and sign-off. And then we have to think about how it's deployed, because there are some things, many things actually, that can be used for good or harm. And so, for example, we've developed technology around voice. And so you can use custom neural voice for lots of really scary things like, hi, will you please give me your bank account number? Or you've been kidnapped. I actually had to tell my mom, if somebody ever calls and says they're me, check to make sure before you send them your money. But there is a really, really powerful use case for people with ALS. When they lose their voices, they can continue to have a voice. So that's super important to be able to think about it in both ways. But I also think we cannot do it by ourselves. We cannot think about all of the potential harms. And so it's why it's really important to have conversations with folks like Peggy, with civil society, with just generally people who don't sit in tech companies who can help us think about, these are the ways that technology could be used for harm. And then the third place we really have to engage is with government to encourage regulation. And it's both to encourage the regulation, but also to help regulators really understand the technology so they know how to regulate the technology. And it can be really easy to think here come the tech companies, they're trying to talk you out of regulation. No, it's actually you got to regulate the right things. You've got to regulate the cloud providers, you've got to regulate the large language models, and you've got to regulate the app makers in different ways because they create different potential harms.
And I think it's fair to say, you tell me, right now, there's essentially no regulation. I mean, it's the Wild West. So you may have some big companies that are doing the right thing, but someone else, let's say a nefarious actor, could use an existing large language model, upload data of their citizens, use it to surveil or target people. All of that is, I assume, absolutely practically doable right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think we do have to remember that law does currently exist, and some laws do regulate some of the behavior here, and I think that's a really important thing to keep coming back to. But yeah, I mean, and certainly Europe is kind of at the forefront of regulation, which, it may be just like GDPR, where it ends up regulating the world. But yeah, I mean, it's relatively unregulated to the specific technology.
Yeah. Well, let's get Philippe into the discussion. Philippe Stoll, you, like Teresa, have a title that probably wouldn't have existed even until very recently. You're the Senior Techplomacy Delegate for ICRC. And I wonder what your take is on this as you meet with tech companies and others in the space, and as you consider what I just said about sort of the Wild West moment that we're in. Is there yet in the humanitarian community a sense of how quickly this could advance? Or does this seem to your colleagues in the humanitarian community that this is a bit far off, that we're talking about something that's maybe 10 or 20 years down the road and we have time before we get there?
So I guess that my vice president set quite well the scene for the ICRC. For the rest of the sector, I'm not so much really aware of what's going on, but there is a sense of emergency or urgency within the ICRC, this is for sure. We see the impact today on conflict situation. And the analogy that Professor Russell mentioned between landmines and autonomous weapons is something that we keep saying. And for us, it's an interesting process. Indeed, I would never imagine I would have this work, and I would never imagine that throughout history of the ICRC, where we had contact with military, with the government, etc., we would have to have something, kind of a strong dialogue with the tech sector. We used to have a little bit of discussions as service provider or to try to improve a little bit our system. But as really this discussion of the law, how it impacts conflict, how it impacts population, this is brand new. So it's a new language. We are learning. It's complex, it's slow, but it's also indeed within an organization, not always the first thought that people have. Still within the organization, people wonder what I'm doing, because you're not saving children in remote places around the world. But yet, we know that it's coming up. There is this kind of events that are quite critical to bring these issues to life, but also the leadership of the organization. And I see the UN joining the ICRC for this joint call that Gilles has mentioned just before, of trying to prohibit the use of certain autonomous weapons, specifically the offensive ones, so that I guess there is a realization that this is today and it's an emergency.
And it seems to me a potential, maybe a budding alliance, others here can comment if I'm right, that this is a somewhat unique case in which militaries themselves of the most advanced countries and the tech companies, the biggest ones that are leading in this space, and the humanitarian community are all in a sense aligned, because there isn't anyone here who wants the Wild West, I don't think, including the military actors, because this is essentially a huge asymmetry for the bad guys, whoever they are, as Stuart outlined them. And so there is an opportunity, I suppose, if we can get ahead of this, to control it. But it seems like in the same way, Peggy, you mentioned that ChatGPT created this awareness around what AI can do. My sense is this year, and all the elections happening, is going to create another layer of awareness, and maybe not in a very good way, but a layer of awareness about what these tools can do around disinformation. You began to talk about that. I just want to open that to you and anyone else who wants to comment on what you think this year could mean for the deployment of these tools.
Yeah, I mean, the disinformation space is one where, there's so many different conversations within the one conversation about disinformation. But the Gen AI space is one that has really opened up. And we were just having a conversation earlier today about deepfakes and their potential impact on elections, something that we have the technology and presumably the will to do something about, but it hasn't been done yet. So we're really looking to leaders, including Microsoft, to move things forward on those issues where we have some viable solutions. The problem is, of course, the disinformation environment that we deal with. There isn't one, flip a switch, we're going to get rid of disinformation online. and certainly not in any way that wouldn't have a massive impact on freedom of expression and human rights. So what we're really looking for is a multifaceted approach that raises the way in which we engage with the public so that they are looking for trustworthy information in different ways. That's a crucial component. But we're also really calling upon those, the tech companies and others that are engaged in this space to do more in terms of content moderation and to do it more transparently. And we see that particularly, for example, in conflict settings like right now.
And I think this is going to play out in real time. Those of us in journalism, I expect you'll see people will see something online. They'll think, is this real or is this not? Then they might want to check with a trusted source. But all of that takes time. And by the time they get there, that deepfake may have made its way around the world. It may have already incited people. And only some percentage of the people who saw it on, you name the platform, TikTok or X or wherever, might actually go to CNN.com to see, is it real? What are you working on at Microsoft as you kind of look at the 60% of the world that's voting this year and all of the many elections, including in many contentious places around the world?
Yeah, I think it's both sides. You specifically called out deepfakes. We're doing a lot of work around a lot of different issues on this, but I think there's two sides of that, which is one, for people who want to be identified as trusted speakers, can we start to build in trust indicators? So if you're a journalist and you want people to trust what you say, what do you need to do to build in, whether it's through a technological watermark or certain, external trust indicators? What are those things you need to do? Because I think we've focused a lot on, what is the misinformation, but I think we need to kind of get grounded in what is the good information. There is, on the other side of it, there is definitely opportunity to help detect deepfakes and to work together across the tech industry to share information in the same way that we do with, violent extremist content. Immediate action that takes things down or de-amplifies or, where we take some steps so that those deepfakes don't make it all the way around the world and then have to be, where then the journalists need to come in and say, that's not true, that's not true. So, I will say, when you said the thing about ChatGPT getting everyone talking, people are talking about mis and disinformation. And the downside is people don't quite know what to trust. But I do think people are looking a little bit deeper when they see something like, I don't know if that's real. Not everybody. We have a long way to go. But I like to think of myself as an optimist. So I do think that the conversation there are so many more people aware that, maybe this conflict is started by a nation state, a hostile nation state. Maybe this isn't a real image of somebody saying a thing that I don't think they said. Maybe we will, there was an example earlier in the conversation about crowdsourcing fake videos. People are like, oh, I saw the original video. So once it's gotten a lot of uptake, folks that who saw the original are like, that's not what was actually said. And the crowd, helps with, letting people know that it's not real. So we've made a lot of progress since 2016. We have a long way to go.
And we're going to see how that all
plays out now.
We're going
to see how it plays out.
I do want to warn all of you, I want to come to you for questions in just a moment, but I want to hear Stuart's take on this topic, but also in generally, how do you think we go forward, in particular in the area you're most focused on, which are the military aspect of this? You laid out brilliantly why we should be worried. What do we do? Can we actually regulate things as cheap as $10 drones?
Yeah, so there are interesting parallels between the military and the disinformation and even think about spam, right? It's scalable harm. Mm-hmm. It's the fact that basically with a computer, you can say for 1 to a billion do, and it does a thing a billion times, which is great, when you're adding numbers, but not so great when you're sending spam or generating disinformation. I was at a very scary hearing in the UK Parliament where a disinformation expert talked about what they call influence GPT, where you simply say, I would like, Switzerland to break up into 3 different linguistic competing units, right? By sowing discord between people, by targeting, email, social media, deepfake stuff, whatever it takes, and the system itself just does it, right? Literally, that's all you have to say.
Yeah, if it's an agent and it's connected to email servers, everything else, it can do it.
Right, and that, so that technology is coming down the line. He said probably being used for this year's elections. So coming back to your question, what do we do about lethal autonomous weapons? So why have we not already regulated? There are more than 90 countries who have said we support a ban on lethal autonomous weapons. There are, I believe, 10 or 11 that are opposing that. Unfortunately, that includes the United States and Russia. It's kind of hard to get something done in the international arena when both the United States and Russia agree with each other that there should not be any legally binding constraints on lethal autonomous weapons. It might be that they will just continue that until a few 100,000 of their own citizens are killed. That's one possibility. I hope we can persuade the US at least to allow a partial ban. And this is similar to what the ICRC has proposed, that we ban the anti-personnel weapons. Because those are, at least from my point of view and the AI community's point of view, those are the ones that are scalable, right? Those are like lethal spam.
But aren't they the hardest to ban, just like spam is something you can control through systems, but it's hard to completely eliminate?
I think it's hard to eliminate, but what we want to prevent is large-scale manufacturing. There will still, and there already is, be the capability for converting civilian devices, but we can actually make that more difficult by requiring that they have ASICs, application-specific integrated circuits that can't be reprogrammed to carry out lethal missions. So that's one thing we can do. There's several other technical measures that make it difficult to convert weapons from remotely piloted to autonomous operation. And we need something like the Chemical Weapons Convention, where there's national legislation requiring chemical manufacturers to keep track of who they sell chemicals to. There are certain chemicals that are precursors for chemical weapons that have to be very strictly controlled. And so you would need similar measures to that to actually make this a verifiable agreement. Because it's one thing to pass a ban, it's another thing to actually enforce it, as you say.
So what do you see, Philippe, as the way forward here?
So there's few initiatives, and normally it's not me to bring the bright side in a conversation. I bring normally the bad side, but I have good competitors.
A little less scared after what Stuart just said.
No, there are few, I would say, light at the end of the tunnel. I don't know if it's a tunnel or where we are, but there is some initiative. So the UN General Assembly has adopted a resolution in November 2023, supported by 164 states, so it's a bit more than the 90, but it's still a call to urgently address the issue of autonomous weapons. There is now a consortium of experts, which includes the tech sector, academics, etc., who will come with kind of recommendations for potentially a hard resolution, we hope late this year. There is also the UN High-Level Advisory Board, and I see one of the members of this advisory board being in this room, where they have discussions around the limits. It's not only focusing on conflict, but it still has a potential to bring also new red lights, I will say, or red lines, so that potentially we have also something stricter that goes in the direction of very specific technical measures, because the tech sector is also represented in this discussion. But also we had earlier last year in February, and it will be in September 2024, the second Responsible AI in the Military Domain Summit, which will happen in Seoul. And I think this is also bringing the military on board, because they might see only the positive or the interest in their side. If we bring both sides, I think it will be also something where they have more balance or nuance use, and potentially, hopefully, the personal targeting is, or the human targeting is removed from the different development of weapons.
Okay, that's good to know that there actually is tremendous progress in a way because of the fact that ChatGPT came online and suddenly the whole world is focused. We're probably having the fastest conversation about regulation ever of any technology. Now, where it goes is still an open question, but that is maybe a silver lining. Let's go to questions. We'll take a few of them at once.
Wow.
Okay.
Oh my gosh.
There's one here. There. We'll take all the way in the back. You here, and you. Okay. We'll take you four. So Go ahead, you can start. Just tell us your name and organization if you're with one, and try to keep it brief with like a question mark at the end.
I'm William Mulder from Predict Expert AI. I have a question actually for Teresa that is addressed, because I really like the technological watermark and detail in terms of solution for the information. I would have the question as, what do you say is the best usage of AI for peace?
The best use of AI for peace.
Yeah, well, we're going to take a few more and then you can come back right there. Go ahead.
I'm just curious. I'm Josie there. I work in public health, and I work with UN Women as a consultant. I'm wondering what the potential scope of UN involvement in regulation of AI might be. What you see as the ideal in terms of international consensus, but also being able to enforce. And should it be one body looking at all things AI, or more piecemeal?
Great question. Okay, all the way in the back.
Yeah, Marie Nayar, beyond SCG. I'm a consultant in AI and tech and executive. My question is perhaps more relevant for Philippe and Teresa and Peggy, but perhaps Stuart as well. I think one of the things I was thinking when you were all speaking is currently there is still a gap in policymakers having the education to understand and discernment. You know, not to mention specific tech company heads, but there's a lot of them that are saying things that are also kind of a bit misinformation about the reality of what's peace and conflict in the AI space. How do you think, you know, people like Stuart and others who are kind of, you know, using their insights to provide information, how are you thinking you can collaborate to better provide education for the policymakers themselves?
Okay, thank you for that. And then we'll take one here at the end.
My name is Daniel Stauffacher from ICT for Peace Foundation. And it's good to see you, Stuart. You came to Zurich 6 years ago and gave a great lecture. I really was struck with the question of targeting. I mean, when we think of autonomous weapons, we think about the drones and the mine. But the targeting, I understand, I just saw a report on CNN with an interview with a young Israeli journalist, which is, you know, being deployed or being done now as we speak in this terrible war with both sides, with terrible crimes. Can you a little bit elaborate more on that part and whether that is taken into account in the you know, the negotiations of new treaties?
Thank you. And maybe we can start, Peggy, with you and this question about the UN's role. Because I know Sam Altman is here at the World Economic Forum, and he has very famously called for something akin to the International Atomic Energy Agency as a way to consider regulating this space. Is that a practical suggestion? Is there some other way the UN can organize its role on this question? And is it just kind of giving guidance and policy, or do you see the UN having some kind of enforcement role here as well?
Great, thanks for the question. I think, first of all, you don't all have to accept my answer. There's actually a high-level advisory body on AI that the Secretary General has put together with some of the best minds on across the spectrum of those involved, a multi-stakeholder one that will come up with some additional findings on this over the course of the year, and they've done a preliminary report. So I'd start there. But part of what that preliminary report says, and what I think we already know, is there isn't one solution. It's not we're going to go down the IAEA model or the UNFCCC model or this model. We really need to look at why do we need something, what are the things that we need, and we need to build around those needs. And in my personal view, I actually think, you know, we can't wait to get the one big thing that's going to get all the states behind it and is going to make everything work. We really need to address the problems that we have now. We know that we already have sort of a monitoring and credible information issue. Can't we come together around something that would be an observatory that would look at those issues and report on high-risk cases and have transparency reports that come in from various sectors that are available and have good practices? That doesn't sound like much, but it's something that we could get done in the course of a year. Getting a treaty, getting something that's binding, getting something enforceable is obviously at some point, I think, necessary, but it takes longer to get there, and we have to build that in. We have the Global Digital Compact process this year that will help us start building the framework for that, we hope. And the bottom line is we do need something at the international level because these problems are not going to be solved on a state-by-state basis. And the human rights framework is a really good starting point because we already have the whole world signed up to the Universal Declaration and its progeny, and we have a set of rights that are legally binding that can be brought into this conversation.
How do you see this issue, Teresa, that Joe brought up about the UN and its role? You mentioned GDPR before. I mean, isn't it more likely that for you or for tech companies, you'll kind of look at the biggest markets in the world, what those regulations are, and follow those, and those will become sort of universal? Or do you think the UN does play some role that will matter for a company as large as Microsoft?
Well, I mean, I think the UN absolutely plays a role, particularly. I think it's probably an and. It's both, right? Getting governments aligned is helpful. It's really helpful, even to identify the right problems, which I think is a little bit to go to that question about educating policymakers. Like, how are people even identifying similar problems? Any sort of convening that the UN or other people can do to identify common problems helps us start to address them. I mean, right now the conversation's all over the place, and people want to talk about everything. Which kind of actually, I was thinking, like, how do you answer the question of, like, how do you use AI for peace? Because it's a hard question. But to a certain degree, maybe it goes back to where Stuart started. We're actually not talking about the Terminator. We're still talking about technology that is used by people. And it's, in some ways, it's like more like the internet or software than it is like a very specific social media platform, which is to say that it's super broad use cases, some of which are like really benign, like it will sort your email, that's nice, and some of which aren't. But the problem behind them is actually the people and the people decisions. And so how do you govern the people decisions? And people do harm and people do good. And so to the extent we can find tools that extend peace and advance peace, AI maybe can help us with that. I think it can help us, and it can also harm us. So I guess that's the best I can do with that one, because that was a very hard question.
That was a tough one, William. I think good guys with AI tools can do a lot. I mean, think about the health space, the education space, which could be transformed, including in many of the countries that see significant internal violence, and some of that conflict is driven by poverty and by lack of access to basic services. So there's some bright spots there potentially, but it does seem like there's a lot of challenging ones as well. Maybe you can Stuart, try to address the question from Danielle about targeting and take us a little further about what that means beyond the drone swarm kind of example. What else could AI do when it comes to targeting that we need to be worried about?
Well, so I mean, there's a way in which you can get almost the effect of an autonomous weapon without actually having the autonomous weapon. So the AI can do the reconnaissance to find out exactly where the trenches are, for example, and where are artillery shells falling, and then feed that information back so that within maybe 2 or 3 shells, the shells are landing exactly on the trench. And so you've got a much higher degree of lethality as a result of this combination of modern artillery and automated drone spotting. And again, with electronic warfare, this was remotely piloted drones, but now with electronic warfare, those are being knocked out of the sky, and so they're moving to fully autonomous drones that can still send enough information back to help the artillery. So this is a sort of a strange paradox for some people, because one of the arguments in favor of remotely piloted weapons and autonomous weapons is, and you hear this a lot, it keeps our soldiers out of harm's way. You hear that all the time, right? And in some sense, you're therefore unpatriotic if you're opposed to autonomous weapons. But of course, the other side has the same weapons. And what are they trying to do with them? They're trying to kill your soldiers. And in fact, the death rates in Ukraine are higher than one would expect because of the use of these weapons, both to drop hand grenades directly into trenches, to do spotting for artillery, spotting for missile attacks, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, what about the targeting? I think this might be where Danielle is going, the targeting of individuals.
To differentiate between civilians and armed forces.
The other part that's not being discussed is about predictive policing as utilized in the United States. So when we talk about targeting, right, it's now looking at how it's utilized internally as well as external conflicts. And that is one thing that we're discussing is how this technology is being used to target citizens of individual countries. Predictive policing is being utilized in Los Angeles and in Miami. And one of the panelists was talking about, Peggy, I believe, was talking about how AI discriminates. So for African Americans in the United States, were often victims of predictive policing, which was powered by AI tools. So when we talk about peace and conflict, it's not just with external actors, but also internal actors.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think, Peggy, you earlier referenced law enforcement being not so far away from the military in terms of some of the very same dynamics, and that's a great example.
Yeah, they're actually further than the military. They're allowed to use weapons that the military are not, right? So tear gas, for example, is not allowed in warfare, right? It's an incapacitating gas, so the Chemical Weapons Convention bans it. But it is allowed in domestic policing, which is kind of weird. There are drones that fire beanbags at people. There's all kinds of quasi-military technology that's being adopted for policing. And
Philippe, you wanted to jump in on this.
Yeah, one element that relates a little bit to that, but I'm still conflict-oriented, and I'm like AI, I'm totally biased. For me, it's conflict, the rest doesn't exist. But it's right now we see also the fascination bias towards technology solving some of the problems that were not managed or solved by human beings. And right now we see the growing use of AI in decision support, which means the AI can process a number of information, propose some actions, and the human beings is not capable at all anymore to decide if, or to look at the information, if it's the right information, if the information was biased. Even the technology behind is not transparent. And then you have a human to say yes or no. And I'm sure if we do the Milgram experience now with AI, to which extent human beings will say no to an AI decision. And this is also one of the things we are worried to see the growing use also by military. I don't know in the kind of law and order space, but definitely in the military we see it as a growing and a
So a police
concept.
officer in their cruiser might see on their screen, hey, that kid up ahead, according to the AI, is a risk, is a threat, might be a criminal. And what do? Do they listen to that? It's a might, it's not certain, but does it affect their work as a police officer and ultimately endanger the rights of that person?
Yeah. This is where I do hope, within the U.S. there is the executive order on AI has a component that is focused on civil rights. So we've been working really closely because I completely agree that it should not be used for predictive policing. And so trying to influence there from a regulatory perspective that probably, and this may be overstating it, but doing anything predictive that impacts humans based on AI is super, super, super highly risky, and so should have some human intervention in there before, and although in this case, the human might decide to continue on with the predictive policing, so that might not quite work. So I think we have a lot of work to do on that, because that is absolutely one of those particular use cases that is scary.
So I think we've done a good job of getting this issue on the Davos agenda through this session today. I hope you all agree. But in the few minutes we have left, I thought I would look to our panelists to give us a sense of what are the dynamics behind this issue. If we're here next year, will we see some real progress in the debate, maybe even in the regulatory environment? Or are we sort of waiting as a world, as a society, for more bad cases that will have to crop up where we can point to them and then regulate around them? What is your sense about where we go from here in just maybe 30 seconds each, and any other final thoughts you want to wrap up with? Philippe, can I start with you?
Sure. I think ICRC's responsibility for 160 years to bring these issues of the impact of the way warfare is fought to the decision makers. So we'll continue to do that. And in a way, it's also answering one of the questions, which is what do you do to educate decision makers? We have a small installation which is in another booth, another house somewhere down near the ice skating, the ice hockey ring, which is called Digital Dilemmas. It exists online. It tries to put you in the shoes of a person affected by a conflict that face these kind of technologies. So these are the kind of things we try as much as we can to bring the reality, to try to make the people think about what are the consequences, therefore act on it.
Teresa?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to, we can't have this conversation next year. We will be too far behind. We have to act now. And I think, you know, tech companies need to self-regulate, need to be engaged with, you know, across the spectrum of society, but particularly including with regulation. We really need to answer that question, like help people understand how the technology can be used so that it's effectively regulated. But we can't wait till next year. We can't wait for the bad use cases. We have to use our imaginations.
Yeah. Go ahead, Peggy.
I think the fact that we have elections happening across the globe this year for more than half the world's population is both the greatest boon and the greatest risk. The reality is there's so much that we need to get done, but the very fact that the elections are happening stand in the way of getting the things done that we need to get done. But when things don't go right in election settings, it also gives, one hopes, greater impetus to taking further action following this election cycle. So I'm not as optimistic as I'd like to be about our ability to get stuff done this year, but I agree entirely with Teresa that we really have to chip away at it and do as much as we possibly can.
And Stuart?
Well, I agree with Teresa. We do not want to be having this conversation, particularly around disinformation, where, you know, it's not a huge surprise. People have been warning about this now for several years, and there's been complete inaction. In fact, the social media platforms have disbanded the groups whose job it was to keep track of all this stuff so that they could claim ignorance and not be blamed when it happens, which is a pretty strange situation. So there needs to be real action on that, not reports, not best practices, not platitudes, real action. A second thing I think is likely to happen is that the large language models are already being turned into agents. So instead of just responding to your textual input, they can now take instruction, they can go out and buy things on the web, they can send email, they have access to social media. And I think we will see as a result possibly millions of small-scale catastrophes, right, where people's AI system gives away their password to another AI system just because it asks. You know, and we've already seen this. We've done simulation games involving this, and they just give away your password without a second thought. So we'll see lots of, and that's good, right? I would rather see millions of small-scale catastrophes that get governments and companies to take their responsibilities seriously.
And they get consumers and voters to say, oh, this is a real thing.
Yes, right. We are really, what I'm hoping we don't see is a large-scale massacre of civilians using autonomous weapons. But that might be what it takes to actually break the logjam in Geneva.
Well, speaking of Geneva, I want Gilles to give us a wrap-up closing set of thoughts, if you would, Gilles.
Thank you very much, Raj. Just to say one word on the peace element that you have also alluded to. You can all, well, some of you recall that we had Radio Milcolin playing a key role in fueling hatred and preparing the ground for the genocide in Rwanda in 1994. It was radio. Nowadays, what we see is that hate speech circulates at light speed and across a very wide area in the Horn of Africa or elsewhere to dehumanize the other and to encourage gross violations of human rights or international humanitarian law. And this is highly problematic because it creates greater grievances, hatred, which prevent the mending of relations that is associated with peace. And opposing sides are ready to try to imagine a future together and mend relations, provided the hatred that has been embedded, sometimes from generation to generation, can be somehow dealt with. So it's key, in a way, to make respect for international humanitarian law a political priority, also with regard to content moderation that you have mentioned, and to understand that for global security, we have huge stakes in coming to grip with that, and also having social media and moderation, trying to preserve the space for neutral humanitarian action, which is really under huge stress nowadays because the role of a neutral organization like ours is really under a lot of not only criticism, but really is put into question very vehemently in the social media campaigns, etc. So to conclude, I think that this very rich discussion we had, I could sense that with different stakeholders from the UN, from industry, from science, and of course from states, we need to quickly build and strengthen this web of prevention. And I'm sure that the conversation and the connection that we are doing in this panel will be helpful in strengthening this web of prevention that needs to be strengthened fast. Thank you very much.
I think so. Thank you, Gilles. Thank you, Gilles. Thank you to this fantastic panel. I mean, it's really an incredible panel. Thank you to the AI House. It's great to be a media partner of the AI House. Thank you to the ICRC and to all of you for a fantastic session. Thanks.